The first crack appeared 3 summers ago, a thin, jagged line stretching across the deep end like a lightning bolt frozen in concrete. Michael Peterson had patched it dutifully, just as he patched the dozen other imperfections that had plagued the 30-year-old swimming pool since he purchased the suburban ranch home 7 years earlier. But this morning, as he stood at his kitchen window clutching his coffee mug and staring at the murky water that refused to clear despite 3 different chemical treatments, he knew the time had come. "That's it," he muttered, setting his mug down with newfound resolve. "I'm done throwing good money after bad." The pool had been his selling point when Michael, a recently divorced software engineer with no children, had purchased the home. The previous owners had gushed about neighborhood pool parties and lazy summer afternoons. What they hadn't mentioned was the constant maintenance, the astronomical water bills, and the fact that Michael, who worked 60-hour weeks, barely had time to dip his toes in the water more than a handful of times each season. 3 quotes from pool companies confirmed his suspicions. Repairing the structural issues would cost almost as much as installing a new pool. Michael made his decision quickly, calling a demolition company the same afternoon. "We can start next Monday," the contractor told him. "Should take about a week and you'll have a nice flat backyard to do whatever you want with." Michael spent the weekend taking final photographs of the pool for posterity. As he walked the perimeter with his phone camera, he noticed Diane Keller, his neighbor of 6 years, peering over the shared fence, her tight blonde ponytail swinging as she craned her neck to see what he was doing. "Beautiful day for a swim," she called out with false cheerfulness. "Just documenting," Michael replied. "The pool's coming out next week." Diane's smile vanished. "Coming out? What do you mean, coming out?" "I'm having it filled in, converting the space to a garden." The change in Diane's demeanor was immediate and alarming. Her face flushed crimson, her eyes widened, and she gripped the fence with white knuckles. "You can't do that," she said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Michael laughed, assuming she was joking. "Actually, I can. It's my property." "That pool is a neighborhood feature," Diane hissed. "It affects all of our property values. The HOA won't allow it." Michael shook his head. "We don't have an HOA, Diane. This isn't a planned community." "Then I'll start one," she snapped. "My kids swim in that pool." Michael blinked in confusion. "Your kids have never swum in my pool. I've never invited them." "Because you're selfish. That pool should be a community resource. My property value is based partly on proximity to a pool." Michael took a step back, bewildered by her reaction. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but my decision is final. The crew starts tomorrow." As he turned to walk back inside, Diane called after him. "This isn't over, Michael. You'll regret this." Later that evening, as Michael prepared dinner, his phone pinged with notifications. Opening his neighborhood social media group, he found himself the subject of a blistering post. Diane had shared news of his pool removal and was rallying neighbors against him, claiming his selfish renovation would decrease property values throughout the block. Michael sighed, put down his phone, and looked out at the failing pool one last time as the sun set. He had no idea that his simple home improvement decision was about to unleash a suburban war. Monday morning arrived with the rumble of heavy machinery. Michael had taken the day off work to oversee the start of the pool demolition, and by 8 a.m., the contractor's team had already removed the aging pool deck and begun draining the remaining water. The jackhammers would start once the concrete was exposed, a necessary evil that Michael had warned his immediate neighbors about via a courtesy note left in their mailboxes over the weekend. Everyone, that is, except Diane. He deliberately avoided her house, still unsettled by their confrontation. Michael was in his kitchen refilling his coffee when he heard the commotion. Outside, Diane stood in the middle of his driveway, blocking the path of a worker carrying demolition equipment. She wore yoga pants and a designer athletic top, her face contorted with indignation as she waved her phone in the worker's face. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," the bewildered worker was saying as Michael hurried outside. "You can't do this," Diane shrieked, turning her attention to Michael as he approached. "I filed a complaint with the city. You don't have the proper permits." Michael kept his voice measured. "Actually, Diane, I do. All the paperwork was approved last week." He turned to the worker. "Please continue. This is my property and the work is authorized." "I started a petition." Diane thrust her phone at Michael, displaying a neighborhood signature page with exactly 4 names, including her husband's and her teenage children's. "The community is against this." "This isn't a democracy, Diane. It's my backyard." "Your backyard affects my property values," she shrieked loud enough that several neighbors emerged from their homes to watch the spectacle. "My realtor friend says having a pool next door adds $15,000 to my home's value." Michael noticed Bob and Carol Wilson from across the street watching with evident embarrassment. Carol gave him a small wave of support. "Diane," Michael said firmly, "you need to leave my property now." "I'm not going anywhere until you stop this." She planted her feet more firmly, crossing her arms. The demolition foreman approached, hard hat in hand. "Sir, we can come back another day, if this is a problem." "No," Michael replied. "There's no problem. Miss Keller is just leaving." "Or what?" Diane challenged, her chin jutting forward. "Or I'll call the police and report you for trespassing," Michael said quietly. "Go ahead," Diane spat. "They'll be interested to hear about your illegal construction project." Michael sighed and pulled out his phone. As he dialed, Diane's confidence seemed to waver, but she held her ground, perhaps expecting him to bluff. When he calmly reported a trespasser refusing to leave his property, her eyes widened. "Officers are on their way," Michael informed her after ending the call. "You have about 5 minutes to reconsider your position." "This is ridiculous," Diane exclaimed, turning to address the small crowd that had gathered. "Are you all going to let him destroy neighborhood value like this? What about community? What about my children's summers?" Bob Wilson stepped forward. "Diane, Michael has every right to renovate his own yard. None of us have ever used his pool." "That's because he's selfish," she countered. "It's because it's his private property," Carol added. "We all maintain our own yards how we see fit." Diane's face flushed deeper red. "You'll all be sorry when your home assessments drop." The sound of a police cruiser turning onto their street silenced further debate. 2 officers approached, taking in the scene. The demolition equipment, the gathered neighbors, and Diane standing defiantly in Michael's driveway. "What seems to be the problem here?" the older officer asked. "This woman is trespassing on my property and preventing contractors from performing authorized work," Michael explained calmly. "He's destroying neighborhood property values." Diane interjected. "This pool is a community asset." The younger officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, is this your property?" "No, but..." "Do you have any legal ownership interest in this swimming pool?" "No, but my home value." "Ma'am," the older officer cut in, "private property owners are entitled to make improvements to their property as long as they comply with local ordinances." Michael produced his permits. Everything is approved and in order. After examining the paperwork, the officer turned back to Diane. "Miss Keller, you need to return to your property now. You're trespassing, and if you don't comply, we'll have to take further action." Diane's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. "This isn't over," she hissed at Michael. "Not by a long shot." As she stormed back to her house, the gathered neighbors dispersed, several giving Michael sympathetic glances. The contractors resumed their work, the first sounds of concrete breaking filling the morning air. Michael thanked the officers, who advised him to call again if there were further disturbances. As they left, he couldn't shake the feeling that Diane's warning wasn't idle. Something in her eyes told him this confrontation was merely the opening salvo in what promised to be a protracted neighborhood battle. By Wednesday, the pool demolition was proceeding on schedule. The concrete shell had been broken up, removed, and hauled away, leaving a large excavated area in Michael's backyard. The contractors had begun the process of filling it with compacted soil, preparing the space for what would eventually become a vegetable garden and patio area. Michael had returned to work, checking in remotely via security cameras he'd installed after Monday's confrontation. The cameras, one facing the backyard and another positioned to capture the driveway and front entrance, had seemed like a prudent precaution given Diane's ominous warning. That precaution proved justified at 2:17 p.m. when his phone alerted him to motion in the backyard. Michael swiped open the notification to see Diane scaling his fence, dressed in dark clothing despite the afternoon heat. She landed awkwardly on his side, looked around furtively, then proceeded toward the construction site with purposeful strides. Michael immediately called the foreman. "Craig, someone's in the backyard heading toward the work site." "We're on lunch break," Craig replied. "Everyone's gone until 3. On screen, Michael watched as Diane approached the idle excavator. She circled it once, then climbed into the cab, rummaging through the controls. "She's trying to start the equipment," Michael said in disbelief. "I'm calling the police. Please get back there if you can." He ended the call and immediately dialed 911, reporting the trespasser and potential vandalism in progress. While still on the line with the dispatcher, he watched Diane exit the excavator, apparently frustrated by her inability to operate it. Instead, she moved to the neatly stacked supplies, focusing on several bags of quick-setting concrete. With shocking determination, she began slashing the bags with a box cutter, spilling their contents onto the ground. When finished, she turned her attention to the water hose, dragging it over to create a muddy mess of the spilled concrete. "Sir, officers are en route," the dispatcher informed him. "Please do not confront the individual." "I'm not there," Michael explained. "I'm watching remotely from work." His phone chimed with another call. "Craig, the foreman. I'll call you back," he told the dispatcher before switching over. "We're pulling up now," Craig said. "Some lady is dumping out our materials." Michael watched the split-screen feed as his contractors arrived through the front gate while Diane continued her sabotage in the back. When one of the workers called out, she froze, then bolted toward the fence. Her escape attempt was thwarted when she slipped in the muddy concrete mixture, falling hard onto her side. By the time she regained her footing, 2 workers had reached the backyard. "Ma'am, stop right there," one called. "You don't understand," Diane yelled, her designer clothes now caked with gray mud. "He's destroying the neighborhood. I'm protecting my investment." "The police are on their way," the second worker informed her calmly. "Please stay where you are." Diane's expression shifted from righteousness to panic. "Police? For what? I barely did anything." Michael texted Craig. "I sent the video to my phone. The police will want to see it." When the same officers from Monday arrived minutes later, they found Diane seated on Michael's patio chair, mud-covered and seething, while the contractors documented the damage to their materials. "Ms. Keller," the older officer said, recognition immediate in his voice. "We meet again." "This is harassment," Diane declared. "I was just checking on neighborhood concerns." By climbing over a fence and vandalizing construction materials, the officer's tone remained professional but carried a note of incredulity. Craig showed them the security footage on Michael's behalf, and the younger officer shook his head. "Ma'am, this is breaking and entering, trespassing, and vandalism, all caught on camera. I want to press charges," Michael told the officers over speakerphone. "This has gone beyond a neighborly dispute." The older officer turned to Diane. "Ms. Keller, please stand up and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest." "You can't be serious." Diane's voice rose to a shriek. "Over a swimming pool? Do you know who my husband is? He's a personal injury attorney." "That's good to know," the younger officer replied calmly as he placed handcuffs on her wrists. "He can meet you at the station." As they led Diane to the police cruiser, neighbors again emerged from their homes, this time watching in stunned silence as the woman who had appointed herself neighborhood property value guardian was placed in the back seat, still arguing loudly about her rights and connections. Michael, watching the scene unfold through remote camera feeds, felt no satisfaction, only relief that he'd installed the security system and a growing certainty that his neighborhood troubles were far from over. The charges would be serious enough to require a court appearance, but not severe enough to keep Diane away for long. He called Craig back. "How bad is the damage?" "Mostly materials," a foreman replied. "About $500 worth, plus the cleanup time. We can still finish on schedule if we bring in extra supplies tomorrow." "Please do," Michael said. "And Craig, thank you for responding so quickly." "No problem. Though I've got to say, in 15 years of doing this job, I've never seen anything quite like this lady." As Michael ended the call, his phone chimed with notifications from the neighborhood's social media group. Already the arrest was being discussed, with competing narratives emerging. Some neighbors defended Diane as passionate about community standards, while others condemned her actions as criminal and unhinged. Michael closed the app without commenting. The demolition would be complete by Friday, the garden would follow, and hopefully, with legal consequences now in play, Diane would keep her distance, though something told him the saga of the removed pool had not yet reached its final chapter. 3 weeks had passed since Diane's arrest. The pool was now completely gone, replaced by a level yard where Michael had begun marking out plots for his vegetable garden. The incident had created an awkward rift in the neighborhood, with some residents actively avoiding Michael while others went out of their way to express support. The most noticeable change was the silence from next door. Diane's home remained quiet, the blinds perpetually drawn. Her husband, Jeffrey, the personal injury attorney she'd name-dropped during her arrest, had been seen coming and going at irregular hours, his expression grim. Rumors circulated that Diane had been ordered to undergo anger management classes as part of her pretrial agreement, though Michael couldn't confirm this. He was laying out irrigation lines one Saturday morning when a shadow fell across his work. Looking up, he found Bob and Carol Wilson standing at his open garden gate. "Mind if we come in?" Bob asked, holding up a 6-pack of craft beer. "We brought refreshments." "And information," Carol added, her voice lowered conspiratorially. Michael welcomed them into his backyard, where a small patio table and chairs now sat on newly laid flagstones. As they settled in, Carol glanced toward Diane's house. "So you haven't heard the latest?" Michael shook his head. "I've been keeping my distance from neighborhood gossip, trying to move past the whole situation." Bob popped open a beer and handed it to Michael. "Well, the situation isn't quite done moving past you. Jeffrey filed for divorce last week." "What?" Michael nearly choked on his drink. "Because of the pool thing?" Carol leaned forward. Apparently, this was the last straw. According to Marjorie, Jeffrey's secretary, Diane's been involved in 3 other neighborhood disputes in the past year. One with the Thompsons over their fence height, another with a new family on Elm about their holiday decorations being tacky, and something about the McNamara's boat parking. Michael frowned. "I had no idea. She always seemed intense, but not to this extent." "Jeffrey's been covering up her conflicts, making legal threats when necessary to keep people quiet," Bob explained. But the arrest was public. His law partners weren't thrilled about the publicity. "I don't wish family troubles on anyone," Michael said slowly, "even Diane." "That's not all," Carol continued, lowering her voice further. "The real estate agent's sign goes up Monday. They're selling the house." The news hit Michael with unexpected force. While Diane had been a nightmare neighbor, he hadn't wanted to drive anyone from their home. "I feel partly responsible," he admitted. Bob shook his head firmly. "Don't." According to Marjorie, Jeffrey's been looking for an exit strategy for months. Diane's obsession with controlling the neighborhood was symptom, not cause. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming. Through the side gate, they could see Jeffrey Keller approaching, his normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. "I'll handle this," Michael said, setting down his beer. Jeffrey looked exhausted up close, with dark circles under his eyes and a day's worth of stubble. "Michael," he began without preamble, "I owe you an apology." Michael blinked in surprise. "That's unexpected." "I've spent years making excuses for Diane's behavior," Jeffrey continued, "covering liability, smoothing ruffled feathers. I convinced myself it was temporary, that she'd get better." He ran a hand through his hair. "The opposite happened. She got worse, and I enabled it." "Bob and Carol mentioned your selling," Michael said cautiously. Jeffrey nodded. "Fresh start. For me, anyway. Diane's moving in with her sister in Phoenix." He hesitated, then added, "The charges haven't been dropped, but your testimony at the hearing will matter. I'm not asking for leniency, just consideration of her mental health issues." Michael considered this. "I'll speak to the truth, that she needs help, not jail time." Relief washed over Jeffrey's face. "That's more than fair." He glanced at the transformed backyard. "The garden's going to be nice. Better than that money pit of a pool, honestly." "Would you like a beer?" Michael offered, gesturing to the patio. Jeffrey shook his head. "Another time, maybe. I got packing to supervise." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Diane doesn't know I'm here. For what it's worth, I'm sorry I didn't step in sooner." As Jeffrey walked away, Michael rejoined Bob and Carol at the patio table. "Well, that was unexpected," Carol said. "Neighborhood dynamics are changing," Bob observed, taking a sip of his beer. "For the better, I'd say." Michael gazed out at his half-finished garden, the newly leveled ground waiting for seeds and plants. The conflict had been stressful, even frightening at times, but as he looked at the transformed space, he felt no regret. Sometimes, he reflected, growth required removing what no longer served a purpose, whether it was a defunct swimming pool or toxic relationships. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his bottle in a toast. "And better neighbors," Carol added with a smile. As they clinked bottles, Michael caught sight of movement behind Diane's window blinds. A brief parting, a face peering out, then gone. Despite everything, he felt a flicker of sympathy. Some pools, it seemed, ran deeper than concrete and water. 6 months had passed since the pool demolition that had unexpectedly upended the quiet suburban street. Autumn had given way to winter, and now spring was arriving, bringing new life to Michael's backyard garden. Where the old swimming pool had once languished, neat rows of vegetables now sprouted, tomatoes, bell peppers, zucchini, and herbs of all varieties. The transformation was remarkable, but the garden wasn't the only thing that had changed. Michael stood watering his newly planted tomato seedlings when he heard the moving truck backing into the driveway next door. The Keller house had finally sold after 3 months on the market. Jeffrey had moved out weeks earlier, leaving the empty house as the final remnant of the neighborhood drama. From his vantage point, Michael could see a young couple directing movers. They looked to be in their early 30s, with 2 small children darting excitedly between boxes. The woman noticed Michael and waved enthusiastically. After a moment's hesitation, he waved back. Later that afternoon, as Michael harvested early spring lettuce, his doorbell rang. The woman from next door stood on his porch, holding a homemade pie. "Hi, I'm Samantha Chen, and we just moved in next door. I wanted to introduce myself properly." She offered the pie with a warm smile. "Apple cinnamon, my grandmother's recipe." "Michael Peterson, welcome to the neighborhood." He accepted the pie, somewhat taken aback by the gesture after months of tension with the previous occupants. "We've heard so many good things about this street," Samantha continued, "especially about the community garden initiatives. The realtor mentioned you're something of a pioneer in that department." Michael nearly laughed out loud. His private garden project had somehow been rebranded in the real estate listing as a neighborhood environmental initiative. "It's just my backyard garden, but you're welcome to see it if you'd like," he offered, surprising himself with the invitation. 20 minutes later, Samantha and her husband, David, stood in Michael's backyard, admiring the transformation. "This is incredible," David said, examining the irrigation system Michael had designed. "Our kids have been begging for a garden. Mind if we pick your brains sometime about how to start one?" "Not at all," Michael replied, finding himself genuinely pleased by their interest. As they chatted, Bob and Carol Wilson appeared at the garden gate bearing a bottle of wine. "We saw the moving truck," Carol explained. "Thought we'd come welcome the new neighbors." Introductions were made, and soon the impromptu gathering had grown. The McNamara's brought over folding chairs, someone else arrived with chips and dip, and before long, half the street was congregated in Michael's backyard, the adults chatting while children explored the garden paths with wonder. "You know," Bob said quietly to Michael as they stood watching the scene, "we never used to do this before, just gather spontaneously as neighbors." Michael nodded. Funny how things work out. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation inevitably turned to the previous owners and the pool incident. Michael found himself downplaying the drama, feeling no need to poison the well for the newcomers. "Let's just say there was a disagreement about property rights," he summarized. Samantha looked thoughtful. The realtor mentioned something about the previous owner having difficulties. She didn't elaborate. "Diane had her own demons," Carol said diplomatically. "Sometimes people lash out when they're struggling." "Speaking of Diane," Bob interjected, lowering his voice, "did you attend the final hearing last month, Michael?" Michael nodded. "I did. I spoke about how I thought she needed help, not punishment." The judge seemed to agree. "What happened to her?" David asked. "Community service and mandatory counseling," Michael replied. "Jeffrey sent me an email afterward. She's apparently doing better in Arizona, getting the help she needs." A comfortable silence fell over the group, broken only by the sound of children's laughter as they discovered a family of earthworms in the garden soil. "I'd like to propose a toast," Bob announced suddenly, raising his glass. "To new beginnings and good neighbors." "And to Michael," Carol added, "who stood his ground and inadvertently brought us all closer together." Glasses clinked amid smiles and nods of agreement. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Michael surveyed his backyard, not just the garden that had replaced his troublesome pool, but the neighbors who now filled it with conversation and laughter. The irony wasn't lost on him. Diane had accused him of destroying community by removing his pool, yet its absence had created more genuine connection than its presence ever had. Sometimes the things we cling to most desperately are the very things holding us back. A month later, a small package arrived at Michael's door. Inside was a ceramic garden marker shaped like a pool with a handwritten note. "Planting seeds is better than keeping up appearances. Thank you for your kindness at the hearing. Still in therapy, still working on myself. Diane." Michael placed the marker beside his tomato plants and stepped back, smiling. In the distance, he could hear the Chen children playing in their newly installed sandbox, a much more practical backyard feature than a swimming pool, in his opinion. The neighborhood had healed, and so it seemed was Diane. As Michael turned back to his gardening, he reflected that growth often requires disruption, breaking ground, digging deep, removing what no longer serves. And sometimes in the space where something old and broken once stood, something unexpected and beautiful can take root and flourish.